The static hiss from the speakers was the sound of dying hope. On the main screen of the Tactical Operations Center, a satellite feed showed a cluster of jagged peaks in the Zarian Highlands, a place cartographers had nicknamed the Devil's Teeth. A red icon, labeled Hunter 3, blinked ominously in a narrow, box-shaped canyon. 6 men, the best the division had, were pinned down, their mission to retrieve a high-value defector's intel compromised. Now, it was a simple, brutal equation of survival. They had less than an hour of ammunition and an enemy battalion closing in. Worse, Cyclone Enka, a meteorological monster, was churning in from the coast, its outer bands already lashing the mountains with gale-force winds and torrential rain. The flight window wasn't just closing. It had been slammed shut, bolted, and welded. Colonel Madsen stood before the screen, his posture as rigid as the steel beams holding up the roof. He was a man carved from regulations, his face a permanent mask of stern disapproval. Air assets are a negative, he announced to the tense room of officers and comm specialists. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the final nail in the coffin. The storm cell is impenetrable. Risk analysis puts aircraft survivability at less than 5%. We cannot throw good lives after bad. A murmur of grim acceptance rippled through the TOC. It was the correct call, the only call. A tragedy, but a calculated one. From the back of the room, almost lost in the shadows near the coffee machine, a quiet voice cut through the resignation. "There's a window." Major Anya Sharma stepped forward. She wasn't an operator or a command track officer. She was listed on the roster as a logistics and transport pilot, a glorified bus driver in the eyes of the combat arms crowd. Her flight suit was immaculate, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun. She carried no swagger, only an unnerving stillness. Not through the storm, under it. The Serpent Spine Canyon system runs east to west and opens up into the basin 2 clicks south of Hunter 3's position. The canyon walls will disrupt the worst of the cyclonic winds. It's a viable ingress. Madsen turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. He didn't know her well, only as the quiet major who flew supply runs with unnerving efficiency. He saw a woman, mid-30s, with a stoic expression that he misinterpreted as a lack of situational awareness. "Major Sharma, is it? We have the same topographical data you do. The Serpent Spine is a Class 5 hazard on a clear day. In these conditions, it's a suicide run. We are not sending a pilot to their death on a hunch." His tone was patronizing, the kind a teacher uses on a particularly slow student. "It's not a hunch, Colonel," she replied, her voice remaining level, betraying no frustration. "The pressure differential will create a Venturi effect, but it will be predictable. The airflow will be laminar, not turbulent. Can be flown." She spoke of the hurricane as if it were a simple mechanical problem with a known solution. A few of the junior officers exchanged smirks. The language was too academic, too detached from the violent reality of wind shear and microbursts. They saw a pilot who had spent too much time with books and not enough in the air. Madsen's patience, already thin, snapped. He gestured dismissively at the screen, at the raging storm front depicted in angry swirls of red and purple. "Major, your official capacity here is flying C-130s full of rations and spare parts. This is a special operations crisis, not a milk run to Kandahar. The decision is final. Hunter 3 is beyond our reach." He turned his back on her, a clear signal of termination. "Comms, prepare the preliminary after-action report. Let's document the timeline." The finality in his voice was absolute. One of his aides, a young, arrogant captain, leaned over to a fellow officer and muttered, just loud enough for Anya to hear. "Someone thinks flying a cargo plane makes her a combat pilot." A low chuckle followed. The mockery was a small, sharp sting, but Anya's expression didn't flicker. She had heard it before. The quiet dismissal, the condescending smirks. They were just noise like radio static. The only thing that mattered was the signal. 6 men were going to die. Her jaw tightened by a single, almost imperceptible millimeter. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the TOC, her boots making no sound on the concrete floor. Her silence was more defiant than any argument. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. The humid, electrically charged air of the approaching storm hit her as she stepped outside. The wind was already a physical presence, whipping sand and grit across the tarmac. Palm trees bent low, their fronds scraping the ground in surrender. Anya ignored it all, her focus a pinpoint laser. Her path was direct, leading her away from the command building and toward the cavernous maw of Hangar 7. Inside, sheltered from the growing tempest, sat the V-44 Spectre. It wasn't a standard-issue aircraft. It was a prototype, a ghost on the official inventory, a hybrid assault transport with swept-forward wings, tilting duct fan rotors, and a skin made of radar-absorbent composite materials. It was a temperamental, overpowered beast that most pilots feared. Anya loved it. She found him under the port engine nacelle, his hands moving with the familiar grace of a surgeon. Sergeant Leo Vance was barely 25, but his understanding of the Spectre's complex mechanics was profound. He looked up as she approached, his young face smudged with grease. He saw the look in her eyes and knew immediately. He'd seen it once before, during a sandstorm extraction in the northern province. It was a look of absolute, cold-forged purpose. "Trouble, Major?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Vance," Anya said, her voice low and direct. "I need you to run the pre-flight. Full combat loadout. 8 Hellfires, full belts for the 30 mil. And top off the main fuel cells." Vance's eyes widened slightly. Combat loadout hadn't been ordered. He glanced toward the TOC, then back at her. He knew what this was. An unauthorized flight. A career-ending, court-martial-worthy act of defiance. He had a wife and a kid on the way. He should have said no. He should have quoted regulations and walked away. But he had also spent over 400 flight hours as her crew chief. He'd watched her land the Spectre on a dime in a crosswind that had grounded every other aircraft. He'd seen her feel out turbulence, her hands on the cyclic stick making microscopic adjustments before the sensors even registered a change. She didn't just fly the machine. She communed with it. "The Colonel will have my stripes," he said, the words a statement of fact, not a complaint. "He'll have mine first," Anya replied without a trace of bravado. "Are you with me?" Vance held her gaze for a long moment, the howl of the wind outside the hangar seeming to underscore the gravity of the question. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. "Let's get her ready to bite," while Vance and his team swarmed the Spectre, loading ordnance and running diagnostics with a hushed urgency. Anya went to her locker. She began to gear up, her movements economical and practiced. Helmet, gloves, survival vest. Each piece of equipment was checked and secured with a ritualistic precision. On the inside of her locker door was a faded photograph of a man with kind eyes and the same determined jawline as hers, standing in front of an older, sleeker experimental jet. Taped next to it was a small, embroidered patch, a black hawk with a silver lightning bolt clutched in its talons. She touched the patch for a second, a silent promise, before closing the locker. As she walked back to the aircraft, she ran her gloved hand along the Spectre's fuselage, her fingers tracing a long, jagged scar in the composite skin near the cockpit. It was a deep, ugly wound from a surface-to-air missile over Syria, repaired with a cross-stitched pattern of welded polymer. To others, it was damage. To her, it was a memory, a lesson paid for in fire and adrenaline. The machine had saved her then. Now, she would ask it to do the impossible. The Spectre's twin rotors began to spin up, their whine escalating into a ground-shaking roar that drowned out the storm. In the TOC, a sudden alarm blared, shrill and insistent. A flashing icon appeared on the airfield map. "Sir!" a technician yelled, his voice tight with panic. "Unauthorized takeoff from Hangar 7. It's the Spectre." Colonel Madsen spun around, his face turning a dark shade of crimson. "Who in God's name?" He stopped, already knowing the answer. "Get me a channel to that aircraft. Now, Major Sharma. You stand down immediately. That is a direct order." His voice, crackling with static and fury, filled Anya's helmet. She didn't respond. Her hands moved over the controls, her eyes scanning the array of multifunction displays. Engine temps green, hydraulics in the green, weapon systems armed and ready. She listened to Madsen's threats as if they were distant weather reports, irrelevant to her current reality. With a final check, she eased the collective up, and the 20-ton machine lifted off the ground with impossible grace. Instead of climbing, she kept it low, hugging the tarmac as she accelerated toward the perimeter fence. She was a gray shadow against the darkening sky. "Major, I will have you arrested the second you land. I will see you in Leavenworth." Madsen's voice shrieked in her ear. Anya reached up and calmly switched her comms to the Hunter 3 frequency. Madsen's channel went silent, replaced by the desperate, faint signal of the trapped team. The Spectre cleared the base perimeter and banked hard, not away from the storm, but directly into it. The aircraft slammed into the outer wall of the cyclone as if hitting a solid object. The entire airframe groaned in protest. Red warning lights flashed across the console, and a synthesized voice began chanting, "Warning, wind shear, warning." Extreme turbulence rain hammered the armored canopy, a deafening drumbeat that turned the world outside into a blurry, gray chaos. This was the moment that would have killed another pilot. The Spectre bucked and dropped 100 feet in a heartbeat, the wings flexing under stresses that pushed them far beyond their design specifications. But Anya was ready. Her hands and feet were a blur of controlled, precise motion on the stick, rudder, and collective. She wasn't fighting the storm's raw power. She was yielding to it, absorbing its energy, and using it. She found the narrow, promised layer of laminar flow she had predicted, a river of stable air flowing between the churning chaos above and the jagged teeth of the mountains below. She descended into the mouth of the serpent's spine. The canyon walls, slick with rain and wreathed in mist, rose up on either side, so close she felt she could reach out and touch them. The Spectre was a thread being pulled through the eye of a needle. The sky above was a boiling cauldron of black clouds, lit by strobing flashes of lightning. Down here, in the gut of the earth, it was a world of shadow and speed. The forward-looking infrared display painted the rock in ghostly shades of white and gray. She flew by instinct, her body an extension of the machine, feeling the subtle shifts in air pressure through the vibrations in the cyclic stick. For 20 minutes, she danced with death in the dark, the Spectre's engines echoing off the stone, a defiant hymn against the storm's fury. She was utterly alone, flying on a promise, a theory, and a will of iron. Breaking out of the canyon's western mouth was like being born. The Spectre burst from the narrow confines into a relatively calm bowl-shaped valley, the eye of the storm's localized vortex. Below, she saw it, the ruins of an old monastery where Hunter 3 had made its last stand. Muzzle flashes winked from a high ridge overlooking their position. Mortar rounds were walking in, each explosion kicking up plumes of mud and stone, getting closer and closer to the crumbling walls sheltering the team. "Hunter 3, this is Valkyrie. I am on station." Anya's voice cut through their comms, impossibly calm. On the ground, Captain Eva Rostova, leader of Hunter 3, was pressing a field dressing to her corporal's leg. She heard the voice and thought it was an auditory hallucination, a side effect of shock and exhaustion. No one was coming. "Say again, unknown station," she rasped into her radio, her throat raw from shouting. "This is Valkyrie," Anya repeated. "I see you, and I see the party on the ridge." "Hold tight." Rostova looked up, and through a gap in the monastery's collapsed roof, she saw it. A dark, angular shape hanging in the turbulent air like a vengeful god. Hope, a feeling she had ruthlessly suppressed, surged through her chest. The enemy mortar team, confident and unhurried, was preparing to fire another volley. They had the Americans zeroed. It was only a matter of seconds. They never saw the Spectre. Anya had dropped below the level of the ridgeline, using the terrain itself as a shield. She came up behind them, a silent predator cresting a wave. The men on the ridge looked up from their mortar tube, their faces a mixture of confusion and terror. They expected a gun run, the terrifying BRRRT of a chain gun. Anya gave them something else entirely. She didn't fire a single shot. Instead, she pitched the Spectre's nose down and slammed the collective, forcing a massive column of air downward. The rotor wash hit the ridge with the force of a localized hurricane. Tents, ammunition crates, and the mortar tube itself were lifted into the air and tossed aside like toys. The soldiers were blasted off their feet, blinded and choked by a cyclone of their own dust and debris. It wasn't an attack. It was a statement, an act of contemptuous airmanship that sowed more chaos and fear than any explosion could. In the TOC, the feed from the Spectre's nose camera displayed the scene in stark thermal imaging. The neat, orderly enemy position vanished in a chaotic swirl of white-hot bodies and tumbling equipment. A stunned silence fell over the room. Colonel Madsen stared, his mouth slightly agape. He had just witnessed a pilot use a 20-ton assault aircraft as a leaf blower to neutralize a hardened enemy position. It was nothing he had ever seen, nothing any manual had ever described. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly effective. Anya had just flipped the entire tactical situation on its head without firing a single round. The chaos Anya had sown on the ridge was short-lived. The enemy was well-trained and adaptable. As the disoriented mortar crew scrambled to recover, a new and far deadlier threat revealed itself. From a camouflaged revetment carved into the opposite side of the valley, the blunt, four-barreled snout of a ZSU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft gun traversed, its radar dish spinning up with a hungry whine. Before anyone in the TOC could even call out a warning, the Shilka opened fire. A torrent of 23mm high-explosive incendiary tracers ripped through the air, a glowing red chain sawing through the rain-soaked twilight. The shells tore past the Spectre's cockpit with a sound like cracking whips, each one powerful enough to shred the aircraft's skin and cripple it instantly. "Valkyrie, you've got a Shilka. 9 o'clock high. Break. Break." Captain Rostova's voice was a raw scream over the comms, the professionalism stripped away by sheer terror. Anya didn't need the warning. The threat warning receiver in her cockpit was already screaming, a high-pitched, insistent wail that signaled an active radar lock. Her entire display lit up with the Shilka's targeting symbology. She shoved the cyclic stick forward and to the left, throwing the Spectre into a gut-wrenching dive. The aircraft plunged toward the valley floor, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat. The stream of tracers followed her, chewing up the air where she had been a microsecond before. She flew nap of the earth, her skids just feet above the mud and rocks, using a low, crumbling aqueduct as cover. Back at the main command hub at CENTCOM, hundreds of miles away, General Thorne was monitoring the operation. Thorne was a living legend, a man who had flown everything from Phantoms in Vietnam to stealth fighters over Iraq. He had been drawn to the screen by the reports of an unauthorized flight. Now he watched, his face grim, as the drama unfolded. "Get me Colonel Madsen at FOB Griffin," he commanded his aide. A face appeared on a secondary screen. It was Madsen, looking pale and shaken. "Colonel." Thorne's voice was gravelly, a low rumble of authority. "Who is flying that bird?" "Major Anya Sharma, sir," Madsen managed, his voice strained. "She's a transport pilot." She disobeyed a direct order to stand down. Thorne ignored the insubordination part. He was focused entirely on the screen, on the gray ghost of the Spectre as it weaved through the terrain. "Sharma," he mused, the name unfamiliar. "Patch her comms through to me. Now." The Shilka repositioned, its gunner anticipating Anya's move. At the same time, a heavy machine gun nest on the valley floor, one that had been suppressed by Hunter 3, opened up again, trying to catch her in a crossfire. She was trapped. The Shilka had the high ground, the machine gun had her pinned low. It was a perfectly executed kill box. The TOC held its collective breath. This was the end. There was no escape. "Valkyrie, they've got you bracketed," Rostova called out, her voice filled with despair. "I see them," was Anya's only reply. Her voice was still unervingly calm, the voice of a surgeon assessing a complex problem, not a pilot about to die. And then she did something that defied the laws of physics and aerodynamics. Instead of trying to outrun the trap, she flew directly into its heart. She pulled back hard on the cyclic, simultaneously kicking the right rudder pedal. The Spectre's forward momentum vanished. The aircraft stood on its tail, its nose pointing straight at the boiling black sky. For a second, it hung there motionless, like a hawk spotting its prey. This was the J-hook, a brutally difficult maneuver in a standard helicopter. In a heavy, hybrid aircraft like the Spectre inside a narrow valley, it was considered impossible. The stress on the rotor masts and transmissions was supposed to tear the machine apart. But the Spectre held together. It was built differently, and Anya knew its limits better than the engineers who designed it. As the aircraft reached the apex of its climb, seemingly helpless, she killed the lift from the main rotors. The Spectre stalled. It didn't fall. It dropped. Like a stone. It plunged vertically, belly first, a maneuver so counterintuitive that the enemy gunners stared for a precious second in disbelief. As she fell, she used the tail rotor to pivot the entire airframe a full 180 degrees. She then flared the main rotors with explosive force, arresting the fall just feet from the ground and converting the vertical drop into forward momentum. The entire sequence took less than 5 seconds. She had entered the maneuver facing north, trapped. She exited it facing south, screaming along the ground at over 100 knots, perfectly shielded from the Shilka by a massive granite outcrop. She had used the terrain feature that was supposed to be her coffin as her shield. In the CENTCOM command room, General Thorne, who had been leaning forward, slowly sat back in his chair. His face was pale. "My God!" he whispered to himself, so quietly his aide barely heard him. "That's a Corvus stall. I haven't seen that since he trailed off," his mind flashing back 2 decades to a dusty airfield in the Nevada desert, to a young, reckless test pilot who had invented the maneuver, a pilot who had died perfecting it. He stared at the name on the screen. Sharma. It meant nothing to him. But the ghost of a dead friend was flying that Spectre, and Thorne had no idea how it was possible. The Shilka, momentarily confused by the impossible maneuver, was now blind. His gunner couldn't get a firing angle. Anya had a 3-second window. It was all she needed. "Fox 2, she said calmly, her thumb pressing the red button on her cyclic stick. A single AGM-114 Hellfire missile dropped from its pylon under the Spectre's stubby wing. Its rocket motor ignited with a whoosh, and it screamed upward, arcing over the top of the granite outcrop like a javelin thrown by a god. The missile's seeker head, already locked onto the Shilka's radar signature, guided it perfectly. The impact was devastating. The anti-aircraft platform, with its full load of ammunition, erupted in a massive, rolling fireball that lit up the entire valley, momentarily turning night into day. The secondary explosions continued for several seconds, a string of percussive booms that echoed off the canyon walls. One threat down. Without pausing, Anya banked the Spectre hard, bringing its nose-mounted 30mm chain gun to bear. The heavy machine gun nest that had tried to trap her was now completely exposed. On her heads-up display, the targeting reticle settled over the sandbagged emplacement. She squeezed the trigger. The gun fired not in a long, wasteful spray, but in 3 precise, half-second bursts. BRRT, BRRT, BRRT. The high-explosive dual-purpose rounds walked directly through the target, turning the sandbags, the weapon, and the men behind it into a cloud of shredded ruin. The valley fell silent, the only sounds the whine of the Spectre's engines and the hiss of the rain. "Hunter 3, this is Valkyrie." Anya's voice was the epitome of control. "LZ is hot but clear of immediate threats. Pop smoke on your position. I'm coming in through the shattered monastery window." Captain Rostova saw a plume of green smoke billow upwards from the flare one of her men had just thrown. The Spectre descended toward it, but the landing zone was a nightmare. It was a small, muddy patch of ground, barely wider than the aircraft itself, bordered by a collapsed wall on one side and a sheer 100-foot drop on the other. A standard landing was impossible. Anya didn't attempt one. She brought the Spectre into a hover just over the spot, then expertly slid it sideways. The left landing skid touched down on the solid ground, while the right one hung out in space over the precipice. She held the 20-ton machine perfectly balanced, its rotors spinning just feet from the ancient stone wall, a feat of stability and power control that was breathtaking to witness. "Go! Go! Go!" Rostova yelled. The 6 members of Hunter 3, 2 of them being helped by their comrades, scrambled from the ruins. They ran, heads down, under the spinning rotor blades and piled into the Spectre's troop bay. The whole process took 17 seconds. The last man was aboard, and Rostova gave a thumbs up from the open door. Anya didn't need to be told twice. She poured power into the engines, and the Spectre leaped vertically into the air, clearing the wall and the cliffside with terrifying speed. As they climbed out of the valley, Rostova looked back at the ruined monastery, at the burning wrecks on the hillsides. They had been dead. There was no other word for it. And this pilot, this impossible Valkyrie, had descended into hell itself to pull them out. She looked toward the cockpit, at the silhouette of the pilot, a figure of absolute focus, and felt a sense of awe that bordered on religious reverence. The return flight through the serpent's spine was as tense as the ingress, but the storm was beginning to break, its fury abating. Anya navigated the canyon with the same preternatural calm, the machine responding to her slightest touch. As they cleared the mountains and the lights of FOB Griffin appeared on the horizon, a new message patched through to her helmet. It wasn't the furious yelling of Colonel Madsen. It was a low, gravelly voice she didn't recognize. "Valkyrie, this is General Thorne. Report your fuel state and any damage to the aircraft." Anya, surprised but not showing it, ran a quick diagnostic. "Fuel is at 30%, General. Airframe is green. No critical damage," she reported, her tone professional and clipped. "Acknowledged, Valkyrie. Good work. Bring them home," Thorne said, and the channel went silent. As the Spectre approached the airfield, it was clear something was different. The landing pad was illuminated by floodlights. An ambulance and fire crews were standing by, standard procedure, but there was also a crowd. Ground crews, off-duty pilots, and command staff had gathered in silence, drawn from their bunks and offices by the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. They watched as the dark, menacing shape of the Spectre descended from the sky. Anya didn't perform a standard approach. She brought the aircraft to a hover 100 feet up, then cut the power in a controlled flare, letting it settle the last few feet to the tarmac as gently as a falling leaf. The landing was so soft it was almost silent. The engines began to spool down, their roar fading to a whine, then a whisper. The troop bay door slid open, and the battered men of Hunter 3 disembarked. Medics rushed forward, but Captain Rostova waved them off, her gaze fixed on the cockpit. As Anya began the shutdown sequence, flicking switches with methodical precision, Colonel Madsen approached the aircraft. His face, illuminated by the flashing hazard lights, was a mask of stunned disbelief and dawning humiliation. He had written those men off. He had ordered their pilot to stand down. He had been proven wrong on a scale so epic it was career-shattering. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. At that moment, the high-pitched scream of a C-12 Huron jet filled the air as it landed on the main runway. It taxied quickly toward them, its engines barely slowing before the ramp lowered. A single figure emerged, walking with purpose across the wet tarmac, straight past the stunned Colonel Madsen as if he were a piece of scenery. It was General Thorne. He had flown from CENTCOM himself. He walked directly to the Spectre's cockpit as Anya, her helmet now off, swung out and dropped lightly to the ground. She pulled off her sweat-soaked flight gloves, her movements showing a deep, bone-weary fatigue she hadn't allowed herself to feel while in the air. As her right hand came free, a tattoo on the inside of her forearm was revealed under the harsh glare of the floodlights. It was a stylized black hawk, its wings swept back in a dive. A single silver lightning bolt clutched in its talons, piercing a heart. Thorne stopped dead in his tracks. He froze, his eyes locked on the ink. His face went pale, the blood draining from it. He recognized the symbol instantly. It was an image seared into his memory, a ghost from a past he had tried to bury. "Project Icarus," he breathed, the words barely a whisper, lost in the wind and the sound of the cooling engines. I thought you were all gone. I thought. He was the last. Anya looked up, her gray eyes meeting the general's. There was no surprise in her expression, only a quiet acknowledgement. The tattoo was a key, and she had known, sooner or later, someone would find the lock. She didn't offer an explanation or an excuse. She simply stood there, the stoic pilot who had just defied a hurricane and a battalion to save 6 lives. He taught me everything he knew, she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying easily in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the flight line. The he hung in the air, unspoken but understood by the one man who mattered. General Thorne's hard, military facade crumbled for a moment, replaced by a wave of profound, 20-year-old grief and an even more profound respect. He was looking at the ghost of his best friend, his wingman, reincarnated in the form of this quiet, formidable woman. Your call sign, Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion. Valkyrie? Anya gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was his, she replied. I'm just borrowing it. Thorne's eyes glistened. The original Valkyrie, Commander Michael Valkyrie Sharma, had been the lead test pilot for Project Icarus, a Black Ops program dedicated to developing radical new flight technologies. He was a pilot who flew by feel and instinct, a genius who could make an aircraft sing. And he had died in the fiery crash of the XF-45 prototype, the precursor to the Spectre, while perfecting the very maneuver Anya had used to save Hunter 3. The program was shut down, its records sealed, its pilots scattered. Thorne, then a young colonel, had been the one to write the final classified report. You've more than earned it, Major, Thorne said, his voice regaining its command authority, but softened with a new warmth. You have no idea. He didn't offer a salute. That was too formal, too impersonal for this moment. Instead, he extended his hand. Anya took it. His grip was firm, a silent transfer of respect and understanding. It was a handshake that bridged decades of history, loss, and legend. Thorne then turned his gaze on the still-frozen Colonel Madsen. Colonel, he said, his voice dropping to an icy calm that was far more terrifying than his anger. See to it that Major Sharma's records are updated immediately. Her new assignment is whatever she wants it to be, and get her anything she needs for that aircraft. If she asks for solid gold rotor blades, you will find a way to get them for her. Is that understood? Madsen, looking small and utterly broken, could only manage a choked, Yes, General. Later that night, long after the debriefs were done and the base had settled into a restless quiet, Anya was back in Hangar 7. The Spectre sat in the dim light, its metallic skin cool to the touch. The ground crew had already refueled and rearmed it, their movements filled with a new, reverent awe. They no longer saw a transport pilot. They saw a legend. Sergeant Vance was finishing a final diagnostic, his face lit by the green glow of a laptop screen. He looked up as she approached. He didn't say anything. He just gave her a slow nod, a gesture of absolute loyalty and admiration, before packing his tools and leaving her alone with the machine. The wind howled outside, a mournful cry against the steel hangar doors, a memory of the storm she had conquered. Anya walked to the front of the aircraft and placed her palm flat against the fuselage, right over the welded, cross-stitched scar from the Syrian missile. She closed her eyes, feeling the faint, phantom vibrations of the engines in the metal, the memory of the G-forces, the rush of the canyon walls. The Spectre wasn't just a machine to her. It was a legacy. It was a promise to the man who had taught her to fly not with her hands, but with her soul. The mockery and dismissal from the TOC felt like a lifetime ago, a distant, meaningless echo from a world that no longer applied to her. She had spoken her truth in the language she knew best, the language of thunder, wind, and impossible flight. Her dignity was intact, forged in the crucible of the storm, silent and absolute.